To coincide with Valentine's Day, I'm going to be doing a tier list of every single fairy-type Pokemon that is currently in Pokemon GO. Alright, how's it going everyone? It's me, it's Jinsula. Today is going to be yet another tier list video. Today we're going to be covering every single fairy type that is currently in Pokemon GO. And I'm also going to include one fairy type that is about to be released, and I do think it's going to rank pretty high. A lot of these fairy types are really good. Like, they're extremely powerful for raid battles and also really good for PvP as well. Just like the last tier list video that I made, I'm also including an S+ tier because there are one or two fairy types, actually just one fairy type, that I would consider an S+ tier Pokemon. And yeah, a lot of these Pokemon are really powerful, but of course, because this is including every single fairy type, there's going to be a few that I will consider a trash tier Pokemon, and that's mainly because they do not have any value when it comes to gameplay. But all in all of these Pokemon are extremely powerful, and they're going to be really difficult to counter. Unless, of course, you're going up against a Metagross, in which case, pretty much every single one of these Pokemon are going to get knocked out. But if you're going up against Dragon types, or, I don't know, Dark types, or Fighting types, then yeah, all of these Pokemon are going to be pretty strong. At least the ones that are relevant. So, yeah, let's get right into it. Let's start off with, of course, Mega Altaria. This is a Mega Evolution, and yes, I'm going to be including Mega Evolutions. And Altaria is one of those Pokemon that actually gains a typing whenever you Mega Evolve it. And Mega Altaria does have the Fairy typing. So for this Pokemon, I'm going to put it in the S tier. It is a very powerful Pokemon, and I would say that it has a lot of uses. I would want this to be a Pokemon that you could use in PvP, but unfortunately Mega Evolutions are not Pokemon you can use in PvP. At least at the current moment, but Mega Altaria is still really good. Yes, there are better Dragon-type Mega Evolutions, and there are better Fairy-type Mega Evolutions, but when it comes to Altaria, it is very powerful, and also quite tanky, which is a very important trait when it comes to Mega Evolutions. So yes, it is an S tier, very easy pick. Next, let's move on to Slurpuff. This is going to be a B tier. I would actually rank this a lot higher if it weren't for other fairy types, because when it comes to PvP, this Pokemon can potentially be really good. But other than that, you really won't find any uses for it. So, B tier Pokemon, I would say. It's going to make some differences within specialty cups where there's some restrictions. And yeah, it's a Pokemon you should not sleep on. Solid B tier. Now let's move on to Azumarill. This is, of course, going to be an A tier. Some would consider it an S tier when it comes to PvP, but that's really all it's good for. It's the Great League. And because of that, it's kind of niche. I'm going to include it in the A tier for that reason. And then let's move on to the baby form of this Pokemon. That's going to be a trash tier. Obviously, there's no gameplay significance behind this Pokemon. It's basically a collector's item at this point, and there really is no reason for you to hold on to them. Yeah, trash tier Pokemon, unfortunately. Next up, we got Carbink. In terms of PvP, this would definitely be considered an S tier or even an S+ tier, but it is a niche Pokemon just like Azumarill, so I'm going to put it in the A tier. And yeah, it ranks pretty high. I would even consider it even better than Azumarill by a little bit, but once again, it is kind of niche, so it is going to be an A tier. And the one thing about this Pokemon is it's quite difficult to get PvP IVs for this Pokemon, whereas with Azumarill it's a lot easier. So between these two, I would suggest you go with Azumarill because more than likely you'll have IVs that are going to be better for PvP. But yeah, that's beside the case. Let's go for another very staple PvP Pokemon. That's going to be Clefable, another A tier Pokemon regardless. There's going to be a lot of PvP Pokemon in this tier list because there's a lot of fairy types that are extremely good for PvP. And that's it. That's what they're good for. And yeah, it's quite unfortunate, but yeah, these are three solid A tier Pokemon simply because of how powerful they are in PvP. Especially if you give them the move Charm, which I think out of these three, only Clefable has. But yeah, that's besides the point. Here comes another trash tier Pokemon. It's going to be Clefairy, and while we're at it, let's also add the baby. Yeah, these Pokemon, Cleffa and Clefairy, they are trash tier Pokemon. You're basically only collecting candy for them to evolve them into Clefairy, or Clefable. That's pretty much it. Next up, we got, I forgot what it's called. It's a regional Pokemon. It's the Pokemon that you get in Hawaii. This is going to be a D tier Pokemon. It's not good in terms of gameplay in any way. Like, it's not going to be good for PvP. It's not going to be good for raid battles. But it is a collector's item because it is a regional for a very specific part of the world. Just like Relicanth is for New Zealand, you could only get this in Hawaii. So we're going to put this in the D tier simply because if you have one of these, it is pretty solid bragging rights. So yeah. Next up, we got Cottony. This is going to be a trash tier Pokemon. No significance in terms of gameplay. I realize the order of this is going to be kind of weird. I do not know why Tier Maker just randomly puts your stuff, like, randomly. I actually had these numbered, these image files numbered, so they were in a very specific order, but when I uploaded them to Tier Maker, they just got jumbled up. So we're just gonna, you know, put these in as we go along. Next up, oh, I'm really bad with Pokemon names. This is something B. Yeah, regardless, it's trash tier. Nothing significant with it. The Dene is going to be a B tier, much for the same reasons as Slurpuff. It's pretty good for PvP. You could fit it into a lot of different teams, but it's not going to be in the upper echelon of PvP, unfortunately. It's still a pretty good Pokemon, and there are a few specialty cups where this Pokemon will shine, but the Dene is going to be a solid B tier pick. Next up, we got, oh my gosh, I forgot the name of this Pokemon, Diancie. This is regular Diancie. I'm going to put this in the A tier. It's a mythical Pokemon. No gameplay significance with this Pokemon. It's not going to be that great in PvP, maybe in some specialty cups. It's not necessarily going to be that great for raid battles, but it does have a Mega Evolution. And that Mega Evolution is going to be a solid S tier. In fact, I would say it's probably more useful than Mega Altaria. So yeah, why don't we do this? I'm going to bump Mega Altaria down to the A tier simply because there are better Mega Evolutions. And yeah, Mega Diancie is one of those Mega Evolutions. Next up, we got a Pokemon that is actually not in the game, and this is the one Pokemon that I mentioned earlier that is going to be coming to Pokemon GO really soon. And that is going to be the incarnate form of Enamorus. And that's going to be, let's say, I'm going to say it's an A tier. I actually do not know how meta this Pokemon is going to be. It's most likely going to be a very solid raid Pokemon, but there are better options, I believe, when it comes to fairy types. But for now, I'm going to put it in the A tier. Let's see how it goes when it finally gets released. Next up, we got Flabebe. This Pokemon recently was featured for an in-game event. And it's going to be trash tier, unfortunately. Actually, I think Flabebe is going to be featured in a future upcoming event. Festival of Love, I believe it is. But yeah, it's a trash tier. Nothing too special about it. Same goes for its evolution. But Florges, its final evolve form, that's going to be an A tier Pokemon. Why do I say that? Well, when it comes to the Master Premier League, this is one of the most essential Pokemon to have. If you still do not have yourself a maxed out Florges, I think it's actually high priority, simply because if they ever bring back the Master Premier League, you're going to see a whole bunch of these. And if you don't have one yourself, you're going to fall behind. As simple as that. Alright, next up, let's get into the heavy hitters. Actually, before we dive into these, I'm going to put their evolve forms into the tier list, Routes and Kirlia. So you should know what's coming up next. We have Gardevoir. Gardevoir is going to be an S tier Pokemon. It is the top fairy type raid attacker right now. That's not a Mega Evolution, and if you have the Shadow form of this Pokemon, you're going to deal boatloads of fairy type damage in raids. Definitely a heavy favorite to be an S tier Pokemon. And then of course we got the Mega version of this Pokemon, and this is going to be a very easy S+ tier. When it comes to fairy types, Mega Gardevoir is going to be as powerful as what Mega Rayquaza is for dragon types. That is something you should not ignore. It might be the only Pokemon I put up here in the S+ tier, but compared to every single other fairy type when it comes to raid battles, it is not going to be rivaled by anyone. So yeah, because of that, I have to put it in the S+ tier. Now, if I had separate entries for Shadow Pokemon, then Shadow Gardevoir would be up here as well. Mainly because Shadow Gardevoir does actually rival the Mega Evolution when it comes to damage. But because it's going to be including the normal version alongside its Shadow version, I'm going to put it in the S tier. But yeah, in terms of S+, it's going to be Mega Gardevoir. Easy, easy pick. Next up, we got Granbull. This is going to be an A tier Pokemon simply because of PvP. I would say it's a little bit better than Clefable when it comes to PvP. Like, you're going to see a lot more Granbulls than you will Clefables, but Clefable is still pretty good. Granbull is definitely up there as well. The nice thing about Granbull is that if you have the Shadow form, you're going to deal a lot of damage in PvP. If you want to get ahead in the Great League, you definitely need to get yourself a Granbull in order to get there. And then we got, I think this is Igglybuff. This is going to be a baby Pokemon, a fairy type baby Pokemon, which also means it's going to be a trash tier Pokemon. Jigglypuff is going to join it down there. And then we also have, you know what, while we're here, oh, this is Klefki, I believe. Yeah, that's going to be another D tier Pokemon for a lot of the same reasons as this Flower Ring Hawaii regional. I really need to learn Pokemon names. I'm really unfamiliar with Pokemon names up until the Sinnoh region. After the Sinnoh region, I really do not know any Pokemon names. It's really bad. I consider myself a fan of Pokemon, but I just do not know a lot of the newer Pokemon. Unfortunately, I do need to learn, but I'm getting there. Regardless, let's move on. We got Marill. This is another trash tier. Mawile is definitely not trash tier, but it's not going to be good enough to be an A tier. Let's put it in the B tier. It's pretty good when it comes to PvP. It's not going to be top tier, but it's pretty up there. And it does have a unique type combination of Steel and Fairy. Pretty good stuff. It's definitely deserving to be in the B tier because it's kind of in the upper half, but it's not good enough to be in the top half, if that makes sense. But it's not bad enough to be in the bottom half. So yeah, B tier Pokemon, very much in the middle. And then we got Mime Jr., another trash Pokemon, but I'm going to put in the D tier. Yeah, the D tier is basically where I'm going to stick all the regionals because they are all trash Pokemon, but they're not completely useless. They are good trade chips, and overall, yeah, regionals do have some iconography when it comes to Pokemon Go. So, yeah, D tier Pokemon for that. We got Morlul. This is a trash tier. Oh, no, not a trash tier Pokemon. This is going to be a C tier Pokemon. Why do I say that? Well, it's a mushroom Pokemon. That means extra Stardust. So this is actually one you want to catch when you see them in the wild. And then that includes the evolved form. I do not remember what it's called. I know what it's called. I just forgot what it is. But the evolved form of Morlul is going to be a C tier Pokemon as well. Bonus Stardust, very important when it comes to Pokemon Go. Mr. Mime, let's talk about Mr. Mime. This is, yeah, it's pretty useless. I think it has a lot of fans when it comes to the Pokemon community. I will put it in the C tier. It's going to find just a little bit more uses compared to these Pokemon. But yeah, it is a regional, and that's really the only thing special about it. The one thing about Mr. Mime is that it's actually pretty easy to get. There's quite a lot of people who have a bunch of Mr. Mimes because there's been quite a lot of events where this Pokemon was featured outside of its region. So yeah, it's going to be a regional Pokemon that is technically also not a regional Pokemon in a way, but yeah, C tier Pokemon. We got Alolan Ninetales. This is going to be an A tier Pokemon. Pretty niche to Great League, but it's actually pretty good. And the Shadow form is also quite a spicy pick when it comes to the Open Great League. But it's also going to be a huge menace when it comes to Specialty Cups. The reason for that is because Alolan Ninetales does have access to some really powerful Psychic type attacks and Ice type attacks, as well as Fairy type attacks. So this Pokemon is very versatile. So if you want a very nice spicy Pokemon to round out your teams, definitely consider Alolan Ninetales. Then we got Primarina, I believe it's what it's called. This is going to be a B tier Pokemon. Really good for the Master League as well as the Ultra League. I really think this Pokemon is one you should not sleep on. But unfortunately, it's not going to be top tier. It's going to be pretty niche, and it does require a really good team setup around it. And there's going to be some better options out there when it comes to water types and fairy types in PvP. Like, you could go with Togekiss if you want a really good PvP Pokemon. Or if you want a really good water type, there is always Swampert, which is one of the best PvP Pokemon that has ever been released. But yeah, it's going to be a B tier Pokemon. If you want to use Primarina, you're not going to do bad. It's a pretty decent Pokemon. And yeah, it's something that I think a lot of players are sleeping on, and I think this Pokemon is going to improve significantly once it receives a community day, because Hydro Cannon is definitely going to elevate this Pokemon. Next up, we got Galarian Pokemon. I'm going to put Galarian Weezing right here. I'm going to get to him next, but Galarian Rapidash. This is going to be a B tier Pokemon. Actually, this Pokemon is pretty good when it comes to the Ultra League. There's a lot of people who do use this Pokemon in the Ultra League, and it does perform really well. And then next up we got Galarian Weezing, which is kind of in the same boat as Galarian Rapidash, but I'm going to put it a tier below, simply because it's quite difficult to build around Galarian Weezing. But yeah, it is a very powerful fairy type when it comes to PvP, so do not sleep on it. It's actually pretty decent. Next up, we got the evolved form of the Bee Pokemon from earlier. I do not think this Pokemon is any good. I'm going to consider it a trash tier Pokemon. I could be completely wrong on that. But yeah, I've never seen this Pokemon ever used in competitive PvP, and it's definitely not good enough to be a raid Pokemon. So yeah, trash tier Pokemon for you. I'm going to include Snubbull in there. There's going to be a lot of trash Pokemon, unfortunately. Yeah, like I said earlier, there's a lot of really powerful Pokemon when it comes to fairy types, but there's also a lot of trash. And we have to recognize that. I'm going to put these Pokemon in there as well. Wow, look at that. The trash tier is now double rows. I think that's the first time that's ever happened in one of these tier list videos. We're also going to put Togepi in there. I think the reason for this is because there's a lot of babies when it comes to fairy types. I think that makes sense, considering that most of the baby Pokemon are meant to be cute. And then when it comes to Pokemon, they typically make a lot of fairy types the cute Pokemon. So yeah, a lot of babies down here. None of them are really good when it comes to gameplay. Maybe within the Little Cup. I never considered the Little Cup. I feel like some of these Pokemon actually deserve to be up here. I'm not familiar with the Little Cup, but I do feel like Togepi is good. I'm still going to keep it in the trash tier. But do consider that. Some of these Pokemon are going to be good for the Little Cup. But that's it. Just the Little Cup. Maybe if they ever do a Baby Cup, they are going to be good. But yeah, I mean, aside from those two very specific things, you're never going to use these Pokemon. That's a simple fact. Next up, we got Slurpuff. I'm going to include it in the B tier, much like with Swirlix. It's, not Swirlix. What is this thing called? Maybe it is, yeah, but anyway, Slurpuff. Yeah, let's talk about Slurpuff. So, I think this Pokemon is quite underrated when it comes to the Open Great League. I have actually used this Pokemon. It is a very powerful fairy type, and it has a lot of versatility in its charge attacks. So, I really do think this Pokemon is deserving to be in the upper tiers. Unfortunately, there are better fairy types that are going to outclass it. You know, Clefable, Granbull. You know, there's a lot of these Pokemon, especially Azumarill, Carbink. These Pokemon are definitely going to be better options when it comes to fairy types, but yeah, Slurpuff is definitely up there if you do not have any of these. Next up, we got Sylveon for much the same reasons. I'm going to put it in the B tier. Very good for the Ultra League, but somewhat useful for the Great League. I feel like the only time I run into Sylveons is if I'm tanking my battles and I'm losing on purpose. And when I start to get to the point where I'm going up against players with similar win rates, that's when I start to see Sylveon. So that should tell you everything you need to know regarding how powerful this Pokemon is. Actually, because of that fact, I might consider putting it in the C tier, but I do think this Pokemon has some potential. Like, if you actually use it really well, especially when it comes to the Ultra League, this Pokemon can actually be quite good. And because of that, I'm going to keep it in the B tier for now. Alright, let's move on to the 4 Tapus. The Tapus are, of course, the Island Guardian legendaries from the Alola region, and every single one of them are going to be in different tiers. Tapu Bulu is going to be one of the top tier grass type attackers behind Kartana and all the Shadows and Megas. I'm going to consider this Pokemon an A tier. I want to say an A tier simply because it is actually a really powerful pick when it comes to raid battles. And the fairy typing and the grass typing do complement each other really well. Unfortunately, this Pokemon does have a double weakness to poison types. That's something you should keep in mind. Very scary stuff. Next up, we got Tapu Fini. This is going to be a B tier Pokemon, pretty niche to the Ultra League, and even when it comes to the Ultra League, there's so many Pokemon that are going to out tier it. But yeah, it's kind of like the Ultra League version of Azumarill. So if you can make a team around it, it could actually be very useful. Next up, we got Tapu, I believe this is Tapu Koko, the electric one. Yeah, electric and fairy. It's a beefed up version of the Nene, and it's not going to be any good, unfortunately. The amount of electric type top tier raid attackers are quite bloated, and unfortunately this Pokemon is not even close to any of them. And when it comes to fairy types, of course it's not going to be close as well. So yeah, C tier Pokemon, it's good if you do not have anything else. But aside from that, it's very much mid-tier trash. Yeah. And then we got Tapu, I believe this is Lele, and that's going to be in the C tier. Actually, I'm going to consider it D tier. The reason for that is because there really is no uses for this Pokemon. It's definitely got a very unique type combination, but that type combination is also shared by these two. Yeah, there's never going to be a case where this Pokemon is going to be useful, unfortunately. If you're going to use this Pokemon, you might as well use either of these two Pokemon, and they're going to be much easier to get. Unfortunately, there is no case where I could justify ever powering up this Pokemon. Next up, let's move on to Togekiss. For anyone that's ever come across it, you would know that this is an S-tier Pokemon. It's pretty much used in all three leagues, mostly in the Ultra League and sometimes in the Master League. This Pokemon is a menace. It's got a lot of different moves, especially after it received a Community Day, and it's also extremely easy to get. So this is one of those Pokemon that you do need to fear if you're doing PvP. It's a very powerful Pokemon, definitely worthy of being an S tier, and the nice thing about Togekiss is that it is a very decent raid attacker as well. If you do not have a bunch of these maxed out, then you can go with this, and it's going to be almost as useful. So yeah. Next up, we got the pre-evolved version of Togekiss, which is Togetic. And that is going to be in the trash. Let's say the D tier. Reason for that is because Togetic is going to be your way of getting Togekiss candies, Togepi candies, without having to hatch eggs. So that's something that you do need to consider when it comes to this Pokemon. It is definitely one worth catching whenever you see it in the wild, and it does, of course, give you the evolution bonus when it comes to Stardust, so you do get additional Stardust for catching it. And then we got the evolved form of Cottony. It's going to be in the trash. I do not think this Pokemon is ever useful in Pokemon Go. Unfortunately, I mean, some people might make the case for it to be good in PvP, but I have yet to see this Pokemon make any kind of impact at all. Next up, we got Wigglytuff. Wigglytuff, once again, it is another A-tier Pokemon. Much for the same reasons as Granbull and Clefable. It pretty much has the same uses. It's going to be a charm damage dealer, and it is going to be a major menace when it comes to PvP. If the Shadow version of this Pokemon ever comes out, I would make the argument that it's going to be among the top tier Pokemon when it comes to the Great League, and possibly even in the Ultra League as well. I really hope that ends up happening one day, but for now, we of course have Shadow Gardevoir, so this Pokemon is going to be somewhere in the A tier. It's actually kind of in between these two. I feel like among all the viable fairy types for PvP, I feel like Wigglytuff is the most difficult one to take down. And it does have access to Meteor Mash, which also makes it very powerful. So that's also something to keep in mind. Alright, we're finishing up this tier list. We got two legendary fairy types, and they're both quite infamous. Let's start off with Xerneas. This is going to be an A-tier Pokemon. I would almost say it's somewhere between here, between A and S. The reason why I say that is because when it comes to raid battles, Xerneas is extremely powerful. And also, when it comes to the Master League, if you happen to have a high IV of this Pokemon maxed out, you're actually going to squeak out quite a lot of wins. It has a lot of different utilities when it comes to PvP. It does counter quite a few Pokemon in PvP. And I actually think this Pokemon is extremely underrated. Except, you know, when I do the Master League, I do tend to see a lot of Xerneas, and I run a Xerneas myself. So yeah, this Pokemon is an A tier. I think there's no other place on this tier list it could fit. It's definitely going to be a very powerful Pokemon. Now, the same reasons why Xerneas is in the A tier is also the reasons why I'm going to be putting Zacian. This Pokemon is great for PvP, and you could make the argument that it could hold its own in raid battles as well. But yeah, when it comes to PvP, it has access to Wild Charge. It's super powerful when it comes to how hard it hits. And also, it's somewhat tanky as well. It's got almost the same TDO as the legendary beasts, like Entei and Suicune. So, this Pokemon is actually quite good. I actually think this Pokemon is one you should not underestimate. But yeah, in any case, yeah, these are all the fairy types that have been released in Pokemon Go, and we're going to be getting more fairy types in the future. For some reason, Gamefreak decided to add a lot more fairy types in the later games, and I do feel like a lot of those Pokemon are going to make big impacts when they eventually get released. I'm very curious to see how Enamorous Incarnate Form is going to do. I do think that Pokemon has a lot of potential to be a top tier fairy type, but we really do not know. Like, I don't even think we know what the moves are going to be for this Pokemon. But if it does have a really good moveset, I really do predict this Pokemon could be bumped up to the S tier. But for now, I'm going to keep it safely in the A tier, and it's going to have a wait and see status. That's kind of the tricky part of making these tier list videos with unreleased Pokemon, because you really do not know what kind of impact they're going to have. We can speculate based on their stats and moves, but we always see move changes that elevate or drastically decline certain Pokemon, and I feel like when it comes to Enamorus, I do hope there's going to be some really good moves on this Pokemon. It's got a really cool design, and I think it would be a welcome addition to a lot of different raid teams. But yeah, in any case, besides the point, I really hope that Pokemon is going to have a good launch. It is coming out on Valentine's Day, hence why I made this video. And it's going to be in Elite Raids, which I know is very contentious within the Pokemon GO community. But in any case, yeah, that's going to be it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and followed along with me. It's always quite a big list when it comes to these type tier list videos, but yeah, I really do think there's a lot of powerful fairy types. There are, of course, a lot of trash, like so many baby Pokemon that are fairy types. But aside from that, yeah, I think this list is somewhat accurate if you take into consideration raid battles and PvP, but I would love to know your thoughts down below. What is a Pokemon that you would have ranked higher, and what are some Pokemon that you feel should have been ranked lower? Definitely share those thoughts in the comments, and let's have a great discussion. And as always, thank you so much for making it to this point in the video. If you ended up enjoying it and found it to be insightful and enjoyable, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if it's your first time here. And also don't forget that little bell so you can stay up to date on whenever I upload videos. Now I want to take a moment and give a quick shout out to all of my patrons on Patreon. You make this channel content possible. If you want to support my channel in a big way, you can do so by following me on Patreon, and the links to it are in the description below. Every single member of my Patreon family gets the perk of being a permanent member of my in-game friends list. So if you want to play Pokemon GO with me, like with remote raids or the friendship system, then do consider becoming a patron on Patreon. And if you want to support my channel in a different way, you could always do so by following me on social media. My handle is @Jinsula, like you see on screen, and I'm on the platforms that you see on screen. Hopefully I'll be adding more platforms, but I'm not really good at managing social media pages. But if you want to know what's going on in my life, then make sure you go and follow me there. And yeah, that's going to be it. I'm Jinsula. Hope you enjoyed this tier list video. Be safe, have fun, love yourself, and I'll catch you all later.